As many of you may know, Monster Hunter 6 was recently announced at the Game Awards, and while many people are meticulously combing over the trailer, trying to find what details they can, something that has caught the eye of many is this little satchel with our bird wyvern friend here. A lot of people are starting to theorize that this may be a dual weapon system that allows us to swap weapons mid-hunt. And I will preface this by saying we have no information really on what's actually going to happen and what can change. They might have some plans now that they'll have to change later in development, but I think it is a good idea to delve deep into this and see what this could really mean for both hunters and monsters in the new game. With that being said, I think it's a good idea to lay some ground rules with this. Since we don't have much information at all, we will have to make some assumptions here, and I think a good one to start out with is we'll only stick with 2 weapons. If we dealt with any more, it would get a little complicated, and I don't think they would do any more than 2, at least for right now, but you never know, it might just be a portable item box. Now, along with the secondary weapon, you'll have an armor set that goes with it. I would think you would have your main weapon and armor set, and then you would have a sub-weapon and armor set. This would probably be set in something like the hub or the tent, and then you could swap out whichever set you wanted into a combination and do something that would help, say, bring Rathalos down to the ground, and then something that would be able to combo into it while it is on the ground. I think another important thing to assume is that we'll be able to do this on the fly, and it's not just signifying a portable camp or anything like that. If that's the case, it does really limit what we can do, because in Generation 5, camps could only be gone to if you weren't being targeted by a monster. Of course, if you were close by a camp, you could run into one, but I'm sure they'll have like safe spots where we can set up camp, or just certain time periods where we can't. And if our little weapon system is based on a portable camp, we wouldn't be able to swap it on the fly like we're thinking we could. We're going to assume that we can do this mid-fight, and I would say this is probably going to be balanced out by either a lengthy animation or having to get through a menu first. This is important and forces us to think on our feet whether now is a good time to switch weapons or if we have to focus on dodging the monster before we can get to it. I'll go ahead and just kind of cover this in 2 different categories, no particular order, and I'll go back and forth between them because it will be important, because as I explain one, it'll be good to explain another. But the first category we'll be covering is how it gives an advantage to the hunter, and then the second category will be how they can balance monsters around this mechanic and make them more difficult and more engaging to fight. We'll go ahead and start out with an obvious one. The advantage given to hunters here is pretty good in a multi-monster quest. I think most people are probably thinking about this. Let's say you have a monster like Nargacuga where you're very comfortable fighting it with a hammer, but say something like a Glavenus you're not so sure about and you'd rather fight with a sword and shield or a greatsword. This allows you to swap that on the fly, and even if a monster invades, such as the Deviljho, and you're using a greatsword and you don't really feel comfortable fighting Deviljho with it, but you are pretty comfortable fighting it and Glavenus with an insect glaive, you could swap to that on the fly instead. This allows quite a bit of flexibility in that and lets us just do things that we wouldn't normally be able to with a single weapon system. Another way this could help a multi-monster hunts is with Element. Element really favors a dual weapon system. In the past, multi-monster quests usually took place with 2 to 5 at max large monsters in a hunt. Of course, they would have less health and they wouldn't share a status threshold, making those types of weapons stronger as well. But in the past, if you wanted to use element weapons on a quest like this, you would have to choose the best average element, which really wouldn't work sometimes because you would have something like a Zenogre, which is immune to thunder, and then something like a Mizutsune, which would be weak to thunder. So instead, you would have to try and choose which element between the 2 would be averaged out the best. And sometimes this just was not possible and you would have to settle for raw or status. Now, in this system, while you would still have to play around with averages, you would now be able to pick 2 weapons with a different average element and be able to hunt the monsters easier that way. This would be good in a situation where 2 monsters share an average element or a good average element, while the 2 other monsters in the hunt share a different but still decent average element, allowing you to swap between the 2 elements whenever you needed to and allowing you to just be a lot more flexible in the hunt. Another way this provides an advantage to hunters is if you need to get certain parts from a monster to make gear, or you just need to reveal a certain weak spot for a monster to be able to attack it more effectively. Think of something like a Baroth, which has both a crown and a tail, where you would have to break the crown with a blunt damage type and then chop the tail off with a cutting weapon type. There are so many people who use hammer that just are upset because they can't really cut tails, and this allows you to swap to a different weapon mid-hunt, cut the tail, and then go back to the weapon you're more comfortable with. Another example of this is something like Ignactor, where you can use a fire weapon to soften its hide, and then you can use a water weapon to start dealing a lot of damage to it, without having to wait for it to submerge itself before you can attack. Another example would maybe even be a new monster, similar to Shara Ishvalda, where it covers itself in rock, and you would have to use the blunt weapons to break off the hide a lot quicker, and then be able to use cutting weapons against a weaker, softer skin that's inside the shell. But hunters aren't the only thing that benefit from this change. Monsters can now be balanced around this system, and we can have a lot more interesting and engaging fights. And that's saying a lot because the fights before were very interesting and engaging. I'll go ahead and use some past examples here to see how it could work, and I'll start out with the most recent and obvious example I can think of, which would be from Monster Hunter Stories 2. Now, yes, they are both different teams, but depending on what time they were in development, I'm sure the Stories devs could give some pointers to the Monster Hunter 6 devs, or the other way around. The Monster Hunter 6 devs giving some ideas to the Stories team about using multiple weapons in a fight. In Monster Hunter Stories 2, you had 3 different damage types, similar to the main games except one of them is different. Now you have cutting, blunt, and then a piercing damage type. Of course, the weapons in the game were greatsword, sword and shield, hammer, hunting horn, and gun lance and bow. These all using the cutting, blunt, and piercing damage type respectively. How this would work is that during a fight, if a monster went into a certain mode or became enraged, its hit zones would change. So something that is normally weak to cutting weapons would enrage and become weak to blunt weapons. Or something that covers itself in mud, like a Baroth, would become weaker to piercing damage instead of blunt damage. This is a very easy example of how it could act in the main series, such as a monster, like I said before, covering itself in rocks, or a monster changing its elemental resistances whenever it becomes enraged. A lot of people seem to think that there could be dynamic weather cycles, such as the lightning storms in the teaser, and I think this could actually help out this weapon system quite a bit. Think about a downpour that makes a certain monster weaker to thunder element, or a harsh desert sun making your fire element weapons hit harder. There's a lot of things I could do with this, especially in a dynamic weather system, that could help out this dual weapon system a lot. On the topic of elements, many of you who have played Monster Hunter World might be thinking of Elatrion here. This is definitely a great example. And while he's always changed his elemental resistances during a hunt, depending on what mode he's in World it was much more amplified by that Eschaton Judgment, something that many people didn't like. But think about going to an Elatrion hunt with a greatsword, either dragon or raw, and then bringing alongside like an elemental light bow gun or dual blades, and getting those topples with your elemental weapon, and then swapping to your dragon weapon to peel off the horns before it can change to a different element. This allows the best of both worlds of letting you use a weapon, once again, that you're comfortable with, and then using a weapon that you're not so comfortable with, but helps make the hunt an easier time. Something that people miss that this brings back is the art of preparation. This now forces you to think which weapon combination will work best against each monster, or which weapon combination will work against a set of monsters. I'll give one final example from the past, and we'll dip into Monster Hunter Frontier for this. I don't think this is off the table or out there at all, because we have Espinus and Sunbreak. And a monster I think that is a perfect example and even a candidate for the system is Zerarezu. Probably pronouncing that wrong. I don't know how to pronounce half of the monster names in Frontier. But this Light Rathalos had a special ability. If you dealt enough damage, either being cutting, blunt, or shot, it would change its form to be strong against whichever damage type it was receiving the most damage from. Say you were using a cutting weapon on the tail to deal the most damage to it. Well, now he crystallizes his tail and it becomes strong against any cutting weapons. This is like a 50 hit zone value to a 15 hit zone value. It's very sharp and it's gonna make that hit zone not worth going for. If you are using something like hammer or hunting horn, going for the head would eventually make him crystallize his head, and now that's not a good hit zone to go for. Of course, using a shot damage type would then force him to crystallize his wings, making that weak spot no longer available. I like this as a concept because it forces you to switch on the fly depending on what hit zone you're facing. This is also a great way to balance some new monsters around the mechanic. Think about using a hammer against a monster, and then after a certain point it would strengthen the head, and then the tail would become softer. But in turn, it would then start focusing more on tail attacks, and a lot more attacks that would protect the tail, instead of leaving it defenseless. This allows a lot more risk-reward play, and allows people to get to a good hit zone if they really work for it. They could also do the same thing with elemental hit zones, allowing you to say have a very hard part that is weak to element, and then once you break it with the element, you could then start using a more raw based damage set to deal more damage to it. The practical amount of balancing they could do with this is almost endless. I mean, think about a bird wyvern, such as the drones or the greats, that has minions with it. Now, instead of being forced to shoot them down with a light bowgun, you could switch to something fast like a sword and shield or dual blades to take out the small guys before you take out the larger one. This can also work great in multiplayer. Let's say a hunting horn player has 3 teammates, a dual blade set focused on element, an insect glaive set focused on raw with a little bit of element on top, and then a pure raw greatsword. The answer to this problem would be simply that the hunting horn player could bring both an element boosting hunting horn and a raw boosting hunting horn. And if this would indeed work, you could also make sure one of those hunting horns had a melody extend buff, allowing you to play all of the buffs you need, and then keep it up while sticking to the one set that works well for damage. Not only does the raw teammate get that boost from the raw, but both the pure element and the mixed element teammate gets the boost from both the raw and the element, allowing the team to deal that much more damage, and even making that raw player decide if they want to actually add a little bit of element to get it boosted from that extra song. Of course, stacking hunting horn buffs is just a great way all around, even in single player, and just being able to swap between a horn and a different weapon that can do better attacks against a certain monster is definitely something to think about, and something that'll flesh out that idea even more. Again, like I said before, if they really balance this and work on it correctly, this can be a great addition to the game. Of course, that being said, if they don't balance it correctly, then there could be some issues. If the monsters end up being too weak, it won't matter what damage type you use, so you can just use whatever you want, making the mechanic pretty useless for most cases. On the other end of the scale, the monsters could be so strong that every option is bad, and it really doesn't matter what you use because they're all bad. This is definitely something they have to work on if they want it to be right, but if they do, I can see it becoming amazing and just a very, very fun mechanic. And we still have yet to even see what the gimmick of the game is, and whether or not that will actually work out better with it. Also, as just one last little thing, for Lance, it has a hidden mechanic that not many people know about. If the blunt hit zone is high enough after a modifier that's different in each game, the Lance will use that hit zone instead of the cutting hit zone. It will still do cutting damage and it won't be able to break parts that need blunt damage, but if you just really can't reach the cutting hit zone, it's always just a nice little thing to have if the blunt hit zone is that much better. Another thing they could do is reintroduce Magnet Spike, which can switch between cutting and blunt, and then you could also bring a bowgun weapon and you could have all 3 damage types covered with 2 weapons. All of these are very interesting and fun things they could do if they do decide to go that route. One thing that does make me curious though is what you guys think in the comments. Do you think this would be a good change for the game if it was introduced? Or do you think it would ruin the game as a whole? Either way, I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please consider leaving a like and maybe even subscribing. Until next time, bye.